Canine police dog shocks crowd by recognizing his old handler. After 30 years, most people passed him like he was air. Just another old man in a park, grey around the edges, slouched under the weight of too many yesterdays. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd see the hands of a man who had held a rifle, buried friends, and survived more than a human heart should. His name is Luca Moreno, and he didn't come here for the view. This story isn't just about him. It's about what we miss when we look with our eyes instead of our hearts, what we assume, who we dismiss, and how one quiet moment, one wag of a tail, can pull back the curtain on decades of silence. What happens when the system sees a threat, but a dog sees a brother? You're watching Cracks of Light, where forgotten voices find their way back into the light. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the stories that matter, the ones that just might change how you see the world. Now, let me take you to the beginning. He came to the park every day. Same bench, same time, same silence. His name was Luca Moreno. He was 74 years old, though you wouldn't know it from the way he sat, still like something carved out of stone. But not brittle, no. There was something about him that felt permanent, stubborn, like he'd survived not just time, but the kind of moments that split a life into before and after. Luca didn't say much, never did, but people knew him, or thought they did. The Italian vet, some whispered. Quiet old man with the army jacket, others would say. But no one really asked who he was. They just noticed the outline of his life and left the details to fade. To most, he was just a fixture, that guy on the bench near the third lamppost, always there before noon, always gone by sunset. He didn't feed the birds, didn't read the paper, just sat, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for something or someone. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was that Luca wasn't looking at the park. He was looking through it, every brick, every rustling branch, every kid laughing in the distance. It all existed behind a thin veil of memory. And behind that veil, war never truly ended. 30 years earlier, Luca had worn a different uniform. Not American, not quite Italian anymore. He was a soldier of necessity, drafted into a conflict that blurred borders and buried names. The Balkan Wars were as brutal as they were forgotten. But Luca didn't forget. He couldn't, because the sounds that rang in his ears back then, gunfire, screaming, choppers slicing the air, never really stopped, especially not the barking. There had been a dog, black-furred, sharp-eyed, loyal like gravity. His name was Blackie, assigned to Luca in 1993, back when everything was chaos and no one trusted anyone. Except for that dog, you didn't have to speak his language. He just knew where to move, when to hide, who not to trust. And Luca had trusted him with his life. More than once. They made it through 4 campaigns together, 4 too many. And then, just like that, Blackie was gone. An ambush, a panicked withdrawal, dust and shouts and smoke. When Luca made it back to the rendezvous point, the leash was empty. The handler's grip was broken. The dog vanished. He waited for days, prayed, bargained, nothing. Command said the dog was dead. But Luca never believed it, not really. He buried enough men to know what loss felt like. This didn't feel like death. This felt like a question without an answer. So he carried it with him, the question, the pain, the memory of a warm muzzle. It pressed against his palm under a shattered moon. Some men come home to medals, others come home with ghosts. Luca had no family in the States. He settled in a small California town where no one asked questions, and if they did, he'd answer with silence. He worked construction until his knees gave out, then faded into the shadows like the end of a long day. The only place he ever went, besides the grocery store, was that park. He didn't come for the trees, or the benches, or the clean air. He came because some part of him believed that if he sat still long enough, the world might slow down and catch up with him, that maybe, just maybe, the past would come walking out of the trees, and on that particular Thursday, it almost did. It began like every other afternoon. Luca arrived just before noon, sat down on the bench, rested his elbows on his knees, a deep breath, no phone, no watch. Just a slow scan of the park, the same scan he'd done every day for years. Old habit. Infantry habits die hard. A kid rode, passed on a scooter. A couple argued quietly under the trees. A jogger's music bled out of one earbud as she passed. All normal, except it wasn't, because across the street someone had called the police. A neighbor, probably. Someone who saw an old man in a faded jacket and thought vagrant, or worse, threat. They didn't see Luca, they saw a stereotype, a problem to be dealt with. And when the cruiser pulled up 15 minutes later, Luca didn't flinch. Of course he didn't. Soldiers don't flinch at authority. They just sit a little straighter. The officers didn't recognize him, not yet. One of them, a rookie, maybe 24, approached with the forced calm of someone taught to always expect trouble. "Sir," he said, "do you live around here?" Luca didn't answer right away, not because he was being rude, but because he was deciding. Is this worth it? Do I explain? Do I smile and nod? Or do I tell him what I've survived just to sit on this bench? Instead, he just said, "I come here every day." The officer's eyes narrowed. Another joined him. They asked for ID. Luca fumbled with his wallet. His hands slower now, joints stiff. They took it, read it, didn't really see it. The name, the birth year, the word veteran on the small card tucked behind the license. None of it registered. Another officer joined. In words started overlapping. You can't just loiter here. It's public space, but not for sleeping. We've had reports. Reports. What reports? What crime was there in breathing quietly? Luca said nothing. Just sat there, gaze fixed, like the old stone statues in European plazas. Silent, weathered, unmoved, and then one of them radioed in a K9 unit. Protocol, they called it, precaution, procedure. Luca didn't hear those words. All he heard was K9. His blood went cold. That's when the memories surged again. Black fur, brown eyes, a low growl at the sound of approaching danger. He could feel it in his hands, in the part of his brain that never stopped listening. He'd known one dog like that, only one. And as the cruiser pulled up and the door opened, Luca leaned forward just slightly. Just enough to see the shape of a dog leap out from the back seat, alert and taut and ready to obey. His mouth went dry. His hands trembled, but only for a moment, because the moment he saw the dog's eyes, he knew. He knew. Absolutely. It began, the way it often does, too ordinary to notice at first. A marked cruiser rolled past the east end of Lincoln Park, windows halfway down, a K9 unit in the back, two younger officers in front. Grant was driving, straight-backed, sharp chin, eyes, always scanning. Mina rode shotgun, typing something into the onboard tablet, her brows furrowed. Lee sat in the back, arms crossed, barely blinking. He didn't like wasting time. They were only out here because of a citizen complaint. Suspicious individual loitering. That was the wording. No sign of weapons, no threat mentioned. But the word loitering was enough to justify the check. Grant spotted him first. There, he said, pointing. Middle bench, old jacket, doesn't look local. Mina glanced up, her fingers slowing on the screen. Isn't that guy here most days? Lee leaned forward, squinting. Could be. Or he's casing the place. Seen a few transients hang around lately. A guy sits in the same spot every day. And never talks to anyone. That's not nothing. They parked, stepped out and approached in formation, casual but calculated. One slightly ahead, the others staggered. People walking dogs moved aside. A couple moms near the swings lowered. Their voices. A boy on a bike slowed down to stare. Luca didn't move. He saw them coming from the moment they stepped onto the path. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He just sat still, the way a man does when he's lived through things more terrifying than authority in uniform. His hands rested on his knees. His eyes stayed on the grass, but inside a shift began. He knew this posture: approach, confront, assess. It was how they used to sweep villages. "Excuse me, sir," Grant said, voice level, official. "Mind telling us what you're doing here today?" Luca turned his head slightly. His voice was even. "Just sitting." Grant's tone remained steady. "You live around here?" Luca nodded. "Near enough." Mina took a step closer. "Do you have identification on you?" Luca didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. His movements weren't slow from caution. They were slow from age, from arthritis, from years carrying the weight of things most people wouldn't survive. He handed Grant the ID without flinching. Grant took it, scanned it. Something flickered across his face, maybe confusion, maybe recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Luca Moreno, 74, veteran. He handed it back. "Sir, we've had a few calls about folks camping out here. Public. Park's not a shelter. We just need to make sure everything's in order." Luca nodded once. "I understand." It was the kind of answer that felt like a period, not open for debate. But Lee didn't back off. "You got anything in that bag next to you?" His voice carried sharper edges. The crowd around them wasn't big, but it was growing. A pair of teenagers on skateboards hovered nearby. A jogger paused to sip water, but didn't leave. One mother clutched her daughter's hand tighter. Mina noticed and hesitated. Something about the man didn't feel right, but not in the usual way. Not like a threat, like something deeper. He wasn't rattled. He wasn't confrontational. He was prepared, like this wasn't the first time he'd been treated like a question mark. Lee stepped forward. "You waiting for someone? You've been here a while." "I'm waiting for time to pass," Luca said flatly. The officers exchanged a glance. That kind of answer didn't fit neatly into any checkbox. Lee didn't like it. He folded his arms. "Look, sir, we're not trying to cause trouble, but you've been flagged before for hanging around here for hours. You don't interact with anyone. You don't leave. People feel uncomfortable." "Doe, I look like trouble?" Luca asked. Not sarcastic, not angry, honest, flat. The question hung in the air. Mina shifted uncomfortably. Grant cleared his throat. "We're just responding to a call. Gotta check things out. You know how it is." But that was the problem. Luca did know how it was. Knew it too well, knew that a uniform doesn't always mean safety, that sometimes the war doesn't end with a treaty, it just changes shape. Lee's radio buzzed. He stepped back to answer. Mina kept her eyes on Luca. "Were you really in the military?" Luca nodded. "A long time ago." "You served in the US?" she asked. "I fought with Americans," Luca said. "Not for them. Balkans." Her expression shifted, softened, slightly, but she didn't respond. Grant glanced around. The mood was turning, not hostile, but alert. The kind of alert that builds when something doesn't make sense, and everyone feels it, but no one says it. A teenager murmured, "Leave the guy alone." A woman further down the path muttered, "He's here every day. Never seen him bother anyone." But none of them stepped in. Not yet. Grant adjusted his belt. "Sir, do you mind if we ask you to move along for today, just so we can close the case on this call?" Luca looked up, his voice low, calm. "I come here every day. It's the only place I feel quiet." The simplicity of it landed like a stone. Mina looked away. Grant's face tightened. Lee returned, pocketing his radio. "Dispatch says he's not in the system. No warrants, no complaints filed directly, just some concerned calls. We clear to move him?" Grant hesitated. He didn't like grey zones. He liked paperwork that closed neatly. Luca's presence made that difficult. There was no real reason to remove him, but no clear reason to let him stay either. And in that vacuum, discomfort bloomed. "I think we should call in K9 for a sweep," Lee said. "Just to be sure." Mina blinked. "A sweep for what?" "Drugs, weapons. You said he had a bag." She looked at the bag again, a worn canvas satchel resting beside Luca's foot, not moving, not threatening, just there. "You think this 74-year-old is hiding narcotics in a park bench?" she asked, voice quiet. "I think he's not telling us something," Lee snapped, "and I don't like loose ends." Luca remained still. He didn't speak. He didn't defend. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. "Because, what do you say to people who've already decided what you are?" The crowd watched more closely now. Phones were being held up, subtle but visible. A boy filming behind his backpack. A woman pretending to check her weather app. Even in quiet towns, everyone knows how fast things can go wrong. Grant took a breath. "We'll call the K9 in, just a precaution, sir. Nothing personal, but that's what it always was. Personal." Luca looked at the cruiser, at the door that would open, at the leash that would be unhooked, and somewhere behind his eyes, a door opened too. And behind it, barking, gunfire, a helicopter disappearing into clouds of smoke, a leash slipping through his fingers, a dog that never came back. He didn't speak, just braced, just waited. Because war teaches you one thing above all. Survival isn't loud, it's quiet, it's still. It's knowing how to breathe when no one else can hear the panic. And at that moment, Luca Moreno, former soldier, former son, former man with a name that no one called anymore, sat on a public bench, in a country that never really welcomed him, watching 3 officers prepare for something that wasn't necessary. The dog was coming, but something else was too, something none of them saw coming. To be continued, the K9 unit pulled up without urgency. It never had to. The presence of the dog alone was enough to shift the entire energy of a situation. People watched differently, stood straighter, spoke less. As the cruiser door opened, the dog appeared, black coat tight against muscle, ears high, eyes sharp. His handler stepped out with the leash gripped firm, movements practiced, controlled. The kind of man who didn't flinch when things escalated, because escalation was his comfort zone. Officer Ruiz, mid-30s, ex-military like so many handlers. The dog's name, according to the patch, was Shadow. Ruiz gave a single command. Shadow jumped down, landing with silent precision, eyes locked on Luca, still, reading him. Not as a threat, not yet, but trained for one thing above all, respond. Lee was already giving the rundown. Uncooperative, no clear address, possibly. Concealed belongings, refuses to leave. Ruiz nodded. The leash tightened, the dog's stance changed. Ready mode. Grant stepped in quickly, maybe too quickly. Let's not go in hard. Just sweep the area. Bag check, keep it low. But Ruiz wasn't listening to Grant. Shadow wasn't listening to anyone now, except Luca, because Luca hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away from the dog's face. It wasn't fear that rooted him there. It was recognition. There was a silence long and uncomfortable before Luca said it. Barely a whisper, not meant for the officers. "Nero?" Just the name. No context, no explanation. Just the kind of name a man doesn't forget, even if he's spent years trying. The kind of name he hasn't spoken out loud since the day it disappeared in a hail of gunfire and panic. Shadow froze. He stopped cold, 2 feet away from Luca, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The crowd noticed first. The pause, the hesitation, the break in protocol. Ruiz gave a second command, sharper, "Advance!" The dog didn't move. Luca leaned forward just slightly, voice steadier now. "Is it you?" His eyes weren't questioning. They were remembering. "You always tilted your head to the right like that when you didn't trust something. You hated the smell of diesel. You barked once when you smelled blood." He wasn't talking to the officers anymore. He was talking to memory. To muscle. Memory. To something deeper than command training. Shadow took one step forward, not aggressive, not tactical, tentative. Then he sat, slowly, deliberately, eyes still locked on Luca. Ruiz tightened the leash. "Shadow! Heel!" The dog didn't flinch. Lee stepped forward. "What the hell's going on?" Mina whispered. "He knows him. That dog knows him." No one understood it, not yet, but Luca did. Because 31 years earlier, in a village no one remembered, he'd been assigned a black shepherd with eyes like smoke and a stubborn streak that saved lives. The dog wasn't trained in English, wasn't bred in America. He was born into chaos and taught to survive. They called him Nero, for the fire he walked through, for the fire he never let reach anyone else. They were a unit. Man and dog. 16 missions. 2 near deaths. Once Nero pulled Luca from under a collapsed wall during shelling. Another time he sniffed out a sniper's scent behind an abandoned chapel. You don't forget that kind of trust. You don't outlive it. And then came the ambush. The chaos. The noise. Luca got separated, fell into a ditch, radioed for backup that never came. He was extracted 2 days later. Nero was gone. Base command said the dog had likely been killed. Another handler reported him missing. No tags, no recovery. But here he was. Ruiz didn't understand why his dog, his obedient, award-winning canine, was ignoring protocol. He stepped forward, frustration rising. "I said heel!" He reached to pull the leash, to drag Shadow back, and that's when it happened. Shadow growled. Not a warning, not hostile, but unmistakably clear. "Don't!" Ruiz stopped. Everyone did. Luca stood slowly, his knees stiff, his hand trembling, but he stood not in defiance, in reverence. "It's you, isn't it?" he said again, more to himself than to anyone else. He crouched, ignoring the strain in his joints, held out one hand, and Shadow, Nero, closed the space between them. No bark, no hesitation. He pressed his head into Luca's chest like the years had never passed, like he'd been waiting every damn day. Luca dropped to both knees, his arms wrapped around the dog's neck, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wept, openly, silently, completely. Phones were out, recording, but no one said a word. It didn't feel like a spectacle. It felt like something sacred, a reunion that shouldn't have been possible. A bond that had never truly broken. Mina took a step back. "This can't be real." Lee was pale. "Dogs don't do that. Not trained canines. Not in high alert response mode." Ruiz didn't move. His mouth was slightly open. For the first time he looked unsure. He's never... But he had. Just not with Ruiz. Not in America. Not in this uniform. Luca whispered into Nero's fur. "You made it. You really made it." The dog leaned in closer, tail thumping once against the ground. And somewhere across that invisible line between suspicion and compassion, something shifted, not just for the officers, for the people watching, for the kid filming, for the mom holding her daughter's hand a little looser now, because no one had expected this. Not when the call was made, not when the cruiser rolled in, not when the dog was ordered to charge, but war leaves marks, on skin, on memory, on loyalty, and some marks go deeper than the leash. Ruiz crouched slowly, cautious now, like he was approaching a live wire. "Shadow," he said gently. But the dog didn't budge, not a twitch. His body was against Luca's like a soldier returning to formation. Ruiz reached out, hesitated, then pulled back. "He's never done this. Not once. I've worked with him 4 years." Grant finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Where did you get him?" Ruiz shook his head, still watching the impossible unfold. "Standard military adoption transfer. They said he was a recovery from the EU theatre. Belgian line, but no details." I didn't ask. Mina stepped forward. Did they tell you anything about his history? Ruiz glanced at her. Only that he'd been through active zones. No specifics. Lee exhaled, almost laughed out of disbelief. So you're telling me this dog was deployed in a European war zone, recovered, shipped to the States, trained, and just, found his old handler on a park bench 3 decades later? Ruiz didn't answer. He couldn't, because Shadow wasn't responding like a trained K9. He wasn't responding to commands. He wasn't scanning the area. He wasn't assessing threat levels. He was remembering, leaning his weight into Luca's chest like he was back in that muddy ditch, that cold valley, that village burned to the ground, where trust meant more than orders, where Luca had been his whole world. Luca stroked the fur behind the ear, a spot that had always made Nero go still. Shadow closed his eyes. That was all the confirmation Luca needed, and finally he looked up. There was a bridge, Luca said softly. North of Prigidor. We were under fire for 6 hours. We lost comms. Our route out was blown. I was carrying another man. His leg was gone. Couldn't move fast. I sent Nero ahead to scout. He didn't come back. His voice broke, but he kept going. Command said he was likely killed, but I knew. I always knew. He never failed a mission. He wouldn't just vanish. He must have gotten picked up by someone, maybe injured, maybe captured. He looked down at the dog again, and somehow he found his way here. No one spoke. Even Ruiz seemed to be leaning toward belief, because what else could explain this? Dogs don't fake emotion. They don't pretend to know someone. And this, whatever this was, wasn't a fluke. This was recognition. The kind of recognition that goes beyond scent or voice. This was survival bonding, forged under fire, sustained by instinct. A teenage boy stepped forward, still holding his phone, but now down by his side. Is that your dog? He asked, voice cracking slightly. Luca nodded. He was. He is. I don't care what patch he wears now. The boy smiled and looked at the officers. Then maybe he was never really lost, just on his way back. Officer Grant rubbed his neck. We're gonna need to report this. But his tone wasn't hard anymore. It was softer, curious even. Mina nodded. This changes how we write the file, the use of force, the K9 deployment, everything. Ruiz finally unclipped the leash. He didn't say anything, just did it. The click echoed louder than expected. Shadow didn't move from Luca's side. He wasn't staying because of a leash. He was staying because he had found something, someone, that made sense again. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. My brother was in Afghanistan. He said his dog saved his life too. Luca looked at her, eyes wet but steady. They don't just save your life, they carry parts of it when you can't. That line struck people differently. Even Lee shifted, the edge in his body softening. Because the truth is, no amount of training prepares you for the human stuff. The moment when suspicion gives way to something undeniable, and here it was, raw, impossible, and real. The air around them felt different, not calm exactly, just cleared, like tension had been replaced by understanding, not because anyone explained it, but because everyone saw it. Grant approached slowly. Sir, Luca, I think we owe you a serious apology. Luca gave a half-smile, scratched Nero, Shadow, behind the neck. You don't owe me anything, but maybe ask different questions next time. Ruiz still hadn't moved. He sat back on his heels. If you want to see him again, I'll make sure you can. I don't know what the process is, but this... He gestured between them. This is yours, not mine. Luca didn't speak right away. He looked down, at the dog, the same way you look at a friend you thought you'd never see again. Then he nodded. I'll be right here. And so they sat, man and dog. A bond picked up as if no time had passed at all. Around them, a crowd stayed longer than they should have. Phones were still recording, but this time not for outrage, For remembrance, for proof that not all stories end in silence. Some find their way back, even if it takes decades. By the time the sun dipped behind the tree line, Luca hadn't moved. Shadow still lay at his feet. The leash was forgotten. Orders were forgotten. All that remained was the thing no one could define in any report: loyalty, memory, and something like love. No one moved. The silence had weight now. Not the kind that crushes, but the kind that holds everything still, like the world understood that something important was happening and didn't want to interrupt. Luca sat on the ground, his arms wrapped around Shadow. Nero now. There was no doubt anymore. Not in his touch, not in the dog's body language, not in the way they fit back together like nothing had ever been lost. Ruiz stood behind them, one hand still hovering near the leash he'd unhooked minutes ago, but he wasn't reaching for it now. He wasn't thinking about protocol or control. He was watching something no training manual had ever prepared him for. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. His canine partner, the one with a file full of certifications and deployments, had just knelt into the arms of a stranger like a son coming home. A murmur passed through the crowd. Not the kind of murmur that spreads fear or judgment. This was different. People weren't whispering about danger anymore. They were wondering what they just saw. Wondering if it was okay to feel the tightness in their chest. Wondering why something so simple could feel so massive. Officer Grant stepped back, glanced at Mina, then Lee. All three had the same look. Confusion cracked open by awe. This wasn't about an old man on a bench anymore. This was about what happens when you realize the story you thought you were in isn't the story at all. The boy with the phone, no more than 16, lowered it slowly. He didn't stop recording, but now his hands weren't shaky. His voice, almost a whisper, reached the edge of the circle. He's not just a vet. That dog knew him. A woman, standing behind him, nodded, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. My uncle came back from Iraq, said the only one who really understood him was the dog they paired him with. When the dog got reassigned, he stopped talking for a year, and then came the voice. Rough, loud, commanding in a way that didn't need to shout. Luca Moreno. Everyone turned. A tall man in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, stepped through the crowd. He had a slight limp and wore a dark vest covered in old military pins. His voice cracked with time, but not weakness. That you? Luca looked up. His expression softened, not surprised, not even overwhelmed, just connected. Colonel? The man nodded. I'll be damned. He moved faster than he should have, pushing past the line of officers who instinctively stepped aside. When he reached Luca, he didn't say anything at first, just crouched, slowly, painfully, and placed a hand on his shoulder. I thought you were dead, he said. Last time I saw your name, it was on a lost personnel report. Bosnia, 94. Luca gave a small smile. I was close. Then the man turned to the officers, his voice turning sharp. This man is a hero, not the storybook kind, the real kind. He kept a radio alive under fire for 3 hours in Brezovo. He pulled 3 men out of a blown transport with a fractured hip, and he walked 20 kilometers through occupied terrain to deliver wounded because the medevac didn't show. Grant stepped forward, clearing his throat. Sir, with respect, we didn't know who he was. We were responding to a call. The man stared him down. And that's the problem, son. You didn't ask. You assumed. He glanced at Shadow, now completely relaxed, head resting in Luca's lap like it belonged there. And that dog, that's not your asset. That's his brother. The shift was complete. People in the crowd nodded. Phones weren't just recording now. They were witnessing. Not a confrontation, a correction, not outrage, reverence. Mina stepped closer, almost cautiously. Sir, Luca, I'm sorry, I judged you too quickly. Luca didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His hand never left Nero's neck. That was answer enough. Ruiz finally sat down, cross-legged a few feet away. He was different from day one, he said, almost to himself. Didn't bark unless it mattered, slept light, always picked the higher ground even in the kennel. I thought he was just well-trained, but maybe he wasn't just following training, maybe he was waiting. Luca looked at him, not with anger, but something like gratitude. You took care of him. That's more than I could have hoped for. The old colonel stood again, wincing. I'm calling the Veterans Board. They need to hear about this. The city should be naming this bench after him. Lee, who had said almost nothing since Shadow sat down, looked shaken. How did we miss it? He asked no one in particular. Mina answered quietly, not accusing, just honest. We didn't look close enough. From somewhere behind them, a little girl's voice broke the quiet. Why is the dog hugging him? Her mother bent down to answer, but Luca beat her to it. He looked up, his voice calm and clear. Because he remembers. Simple, direct, unarguable. Grant keyed his radio, requesting to speak to the watch commander. His voice lacked the urgency from earlier. He no longer sounded like a cop handling a scene. He sounded like someone trying not to mishandle the truth. As he finished the call, he turned to Luca. I don't know how we make this right, sir, but I want to try. Luca nodded. Then start by believing someone doesn't have to look like a hero to have lived like one. By then, more people had arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others because they recognized Luca. A neighbor from 3 blocks over stepped forward, eyes wide. You're the guy who fixed my fence during the storm last winter. I thought you were just some quiet old man. Luca smiled faintly. That part's still true. And just like that, the moment turned. From suspicion to pride. From distance to connection. The story changed hands. It was no longer about officers and orders. It was about history and how it lives inside people, even when no one's looking. It was about loyalty that doesn't fade. And it was about how one act of recognition, one dog refusing to forget, could ripple outward and make an entire community remember what it means to see someone fully. Nero shifted in Luca's lap, letting out a quiet, contented huff. His eyes blinked slowly, and in that instant it was like the last 30 years didn't matter, like war hadn't torn them apart, like he had simply been walking home, one command at a time. People started to sit down. On benches, on the grass. Some stood, arms folded, but none of them left. It was like they all collectively agreed that whatever they had going on could wait, because something bigger had happened here, and no one wanted to be the first to look. Away! Ruiz was still beside the dog, no longer handler, just man. He reached out slowly and scratched Nero behind the ear. I thought I knew what kind of partner I had, he said, voice low. Turns out, I only had part of the story. Luca didn't move, didn't look away from the dog. You kept him safe. That's enough. The colonel stood off to the side, already on his phone, speaking to someone with urgency and purpose. Yeah, I'm telling you, it's him. Moreno. Still alive. You get someone from the state board down here. This can't be just swept under some file. He wasn't just making a call, he was making it official. Someone needed to hear this from someone who'd worn the same boots, stood in the same mud, lost the same brothers. A reporter arrived, not the flashy big camera type, just a woman in jeans and a press lanyard, holding a notepad and a phone. I heard the scanner, she said softly, to no one in particular. What happened here? The boy with the phone looked at her wide-eyed. The dog remembered him. He remembered everything. That was enough to make her sit down on the curb and just watch for a moment. Officer Mina leaned on a tree, arms crossed, head low. She looked like someone who was trying to find the line between pride and shame. Then she stepped forward, took a breath, and looked Luca in the eye. You have every right to be angry. I wouldn't blame you. But I need to say this anyway. I'm sorry for treating you like a problem, for not seeing the man sitting in front of me. Luca didn't flinch. Most people don't. I do now, she said. Then Lee, stoic, skeptical Lee, walked up beside her. I wasn't raised to question authority. I was raised to follow orders. But watching that dog today, I don't think any order can explain that. And I sure as hell don't think a threat could bring that kind of loyalty back after 30 years. He cleared his throat, eyes down. I was wrong. You didn't owe us anything, but you gave us something. And I won't forget it. Rui stood up then, back straight, but expression soft. I don't know what the future is for Shadow, Nero, but I do know this, he's yours. Whatever paperwork we need to do, I'll help you do it. You're not going home alone. Grant finally stepped forward. He didn't talk much, didn't try to impress, just looked Luca square in the face and said, We came here to control a situation. Turns out it was already in control. By loyalty, by memory, by love. I don't know what to do with that except to respect it. Luca nodded. That was enough. The crowd, by now numbering over 50, stayed quiet. Someone brought a blanket. Someone else brought bottled water. An older man in a postal uniform handed Luca a sandwich from his lunchbox. You've been sitting here for hours, he said. Eat something. Luca took it, smiled. Grazie. A woman stepped forward, grey hair, eyes red. My husband never came home from Kosovo. Our kids grew up with a flag on the wall. I think he would have liked this story better. Luca didn't say a word. He just reached out and held her hand for a moment. That was enough. The little girl from earlier came back, this time with a dog treat in her hand. Can I give it to him? She asked shyly. Luca looked at Nero. You hungry, boy? The tail wagged once, slow and heavy. She crouched, offered the treat, and Nero took it gently from her hand. She giggled. He's not scary at all. Luca smiled. He never was. Phones started to go down, not because the story was over, but because the point had already been made. The truth didn't need more footage. It needed space to breathe. People weren't capturing a moment anymore. They were living inside one. The colonel came back, nodding. They're sending someone from the mayor's office, and a few Veterans Affairs officers too. They want to make sure this gets the attention it deserves. Luca didn't react. He just kept his hand on Nero's back, grounding them both in the only thing that really mattered right now, presence. A teacher from the local middle school stepped forward, her voice shaking. Would you consider coming in to speak to the students? They need to hear this. The real version of service, of loyalty, of what it means to come home, even when nobody's waiting. Luca thought for a long time, then said, If you'd asked me yesterday, I would have said no. Today, maybe. And just like that, the moment started shifting, not fading, not ending, but becoming. Becoming something that would ripple out through stories told at dinner tables, through kids asking questions about veterans, through officers thinking twice before drawing conclusions. Nero rested his head in Luca's lap again, eyes soft, body relaxed. Not because the danger was gone, but because the people had finally learned to see. This was no longer just about a man and a dog. It was about how we fail each other when we don't look deeper, and what happens when, by some miracle, we do. For a long while, Luca said nothing. He just sat there, hand resting on Nero's back, eyes looking past the people but not really through them anymore. He wasn't avoiding, he was choosing where to begin. Finally he spoke, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. It was winter, he said. 1993. I was 21, newly assigned to the UN Observer Unit along the Bosnian front. Most of us weren't there to fight, not officially. We were there to monitor, but war doesn't care about rules. It doesn't check uniforms before it kills you. His voice didn't change when he said it. It didn't need to. The weight was in the words, the kind of weight you don't add with volume, you earn with silence. They gave me a dog, he said. Said he wasn't fully trained yet, but he was smart, real smart, fast, strong. Didn't bark much, perfect for recon. They called him Nero. His hand paused, fingers brushing gently behind Nero's ear. I didn't want him at first. I didn't want to get close to anything. I'd seen how that ended. Someone near the front, an older man in a navy jacket, nodded slowly. He didn't say a word, but he understood. You could see it in the way his hands clenched. Luca kept going. But Nero wasn't like other dogs. He didn't demand anything. He just observed, watched me, waited, like he was making up his mind about whether I was worth following. He smiled faintly. It took him 3 days. After that, we were locked in. There was no applause, no response from the crowd, just stillness, respectful, focused. He spoke like someone who didn't expect to be heard often, and now everyone was listening. 3 months in, we were ambushed. Town called Velico, tiny place, barely on the maps. We were escorting civilians out, old women, kids. They hit us from the ridge. Mortars first, then small arms. He paused, swallowed. I lost 2 men that day. Good ones, honest. One was 19. He was carrying powdered milk packets in his vest for the kids. Another had pictures of his baby girl in his helmet. I still remember her name. Elena. He blinked slowly, but the memory didn't leave him. I was pinned for hours, bleeding from a piece of shrapnel near my ribs. Couldn't move. Radio busted. But Nero stayed. He stayed beside me. Didn't run. Didn't leave. He licked the blood to keep it from freezing. Every few minutes he looked around, ears twitching. At one point I passed out. When I came to, he was standing over me, growling low. I found out later there'd been a sniper a few hundred meters out. He kept me from moving, saved my life. Ruiz was standing now, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Eyes locked on Nero like he was seeing him for the first time. Luca took a breath. We made it out that night, barely. Evac picked us up under fire, but 2 weeks later we were hit again. Heavy, bridge collapse, chaos. Nero ran ahead to scout, never came back. They told me to leave. Orders. I left that country thinking I'd lost the only damn thing that knew me. There it was. The fracture, the thing behind all the silence, not just loss, but forced abandonment, the kind that doesn't scar your skin, but eats you slow from the inside. Luca looked down. When I got back, no one asked about him. No one asked about anything. I was back, so that was supposed to mean I was fine. He paused again, his voice tightened. But you don't come back whole, you come back filtered. People see your uniform, your medals maybe, but they don't ask what you lost. They ask what you did. Sometimes they look at you like you're dangerous, other times like you're broken, but never like you're still here. He looked up now, eyes moving across the officers, the kids, the parents. I got a job, warehouse work. I kept my head down. Live small, quiet, because when you talk too much about where you've been, people stop seeing you as someone safe. They start looking for signs you might snap. So I shut it all down, every memory, every story, every ache. I locked it away, and I sat on that bench every day, not because I was lost, but because I was waiting. I didn't know what for. Until today, a small voice broke the silence. Mr. A boy, maybe 10, stepped forward, holding the hand of a woman who looked like his mum. Why do people like you get treated like bad guys? The question landed like a quiet explosion. No one laughed, no one gasped. They just turned and waited to see how Luca would answer. He leaned forward slightly. Because people don't always know what they're looking at, he said. It's easier to make a guess than to ask a question. Easier to feel safe than to feel curious. And when someone looks different, or acts different, or doesn't talk much, fear fills in the blanks. The boy nodded slowly. That doesn't seem fair. It isn't, Luca said, but that's why we talk, so it doesn't keep happening. Behind him, Mina blinked fast, clearly holding something in. Lee looked down at the ground, jaw tight. Ruiz stepped forward and knelt by the boy. I think we all needed to hear that, he said. Then he looked at the crowd. And not just hear it, Remember it. Next time someone sits quiet in a park, maybe we ask their name before we call it in. A woman near the back said, "I'm a nurse. I worked ER shifts during the war in Syria. I watched men come in shattered, and the first question everyone asked wasn't, 'Are you okay?' It was, 'Are you armed?' I know what this feels like. I'm sorry we did it to you." Luca didn't respond right away. He just reached down and touched Nero's snout. The dog leaned into it, content, like all of this, every word, every hand extended, was making sense to him too. By now, the crowd wasn't standing around a spectacle. They were standing inside a story they were part of, and maybe that was the point all along. The boy stepped back, his small hand still in his mother's. She looked down at him like she was seeing him differently now, not because of what he asked, but because of what he dared to ask out loud. Around them, the crowd grew quieter again, this time not from shock, but from something heavier, recognition, reflection. As if each person was quietly turning inward, measuring how many times they'd walked past someone like Luca without ever really seeing them. Grant took a slow step forward. His voice wasn't official now, no badge, just a man. "You know, my dad served," he said. "Desert Storm. He didn't talk about it, ever. I thought it was just because he was tough, but maybe it's because he knew nobody wanted to listen. We all like the flag and the medals, but not the silence that comes after." Luca looked up at him, not as an officer, as a son. "It's not that we don't want to talk," he said. "It's that we don't want to be turned into symbols or statistics. We want to be seen for the whole story, not just the pain, not just the scars." Grant nodded. "Yeah, I get that now." A teenager in a hoodie near the back raised his hand awkwardly, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to speak. "My uncle, he came back from Afghanistan and now he just stays in his garage all day. Doesn't talk to anyone. I never knew what to say to him. I thought he was just angry." Luca didn't correct him, didn't preach. He simply said, "Maybe he's not angry. Maybe he's carrying more than he knows how to put down." And that was it. Just one sentence. But it cracked something open. The teen lowered his head, then nodded slowly. "I'm gonna visit him. Tomorrow." Ruiz was sitting again, this time on the edge of the bench next to Luca, his hands clasped tight between his knees. "I signed up to handle dogs because I thought I was avoiding people. Turns out the dog was the one who brought me." Right back to people again. Nero gave a low huff, his head now resting across both their legs. He didn't need to say anything. He had done what no person could. He had reminded everyone watching that loyalty doesn't disappear just because time does. That connection doesn't die just because paperwork says the mission is over. The silver-haired woman from earlier, the one who'd asked to share the story with the local paper, stepped forward now, clutching her notebook. "I think we all came here thinking we were watching another incident, maybe even preparing ourselves for something bad. But what we witnessed today, it was the kind of thing we don't see enough anymore. Grace, patience. A man being fully human again in the eyes of people who nearly forgot how to recognize that." Mina added, "He didn't shout, he didn't resist, he just waited. And somehow, that waiting said more than anything else could." Then the teacher who had spoken earlier about bringing Luca to her school stepped up again, this time holding her phone. "My students don't need another textbook example. They need someone like you, Mr. Moreno, someone who lived the pages we're too afraid to open." Luca didn't nod, didn't accept the compliment. He looked down. "I'm not a teacher. I'm just tired." The teacher smiled. "Then maybe that's the lesson, that someone can be tired and still matter." Someone near the back, a man in a faded military cap, saluted without a word, and then another. One by one, those who recognized what Luca had carried stood straighter, not for show, for solidarity. It wasn't long before someone suggested, A photo, not a selfie, not for likes, but something real, something to mark that this happened. That these people stood together, that this story lived here now. Luca didn't protest. He let them gather around him. Nero stayed close, eyes half-lidded, but alert, still watching, still protecting. As the photo was taken, a quiet filled the space, an unspoken vow that what they'd seen wouldn't be forgotten, that next time they passed someone sitting alone on a bench, they'd pause, maybe even ask a name. Maybe even listen, later as people began to slowly peel away, some with handshakes, some with hugs, some with nothing but a look. Luca stayed seated, Nero by his side, the leash still off. No one asked to put it back on. Grant approached one last time before leaving. "You changed something here today," he said. Luca didn't look at him, just said, "I didn't try to." Grant replied, "That's probably why it worked." The boy who'd asked the hard question waved goodbye, then turned to his mum. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" She looked at Luca, then back at her son. "I hope so. But even if we don't, we saw enough." As the sky turned the soft color of endings, Nero nudged Luca's arm gently. A reminder, a gesture, a closing. Luca stood slowly, the aches of years still in his joints, but the weight on his back a little lighter. He looked around the now quiet park, then down at the dog who had found his way back, not just to him, but through him, to all of them. "Come on, boy," he said, voice low, "let's go home." And for the first time in decades, that word felt like something real again. They didn't expect a crowd, but one showed up anyway. No big announcements, no media blasts, just word of mouth, neighbors talking, friends sharing the video that had now reached over 1 million views in less than 48 hours. The city didn't organize it, the people did. Foldable chairs, a borrowed sound system, a few banners someone printed at home. Nothing fancy, but everything that mattered. The bench was cleaned up, someone had polished the brass. On the back, a new plaque had been installed, barely dry from the engraver. It read, "To those who fought to protect peace, and now only ask for a place to sit. No name, no rank, because that wasn't the point. It wasn't about Luca. It was about anyone who had carried the weight and come home only to find themselves forgotten, until someone remembered." Luca didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. He sat where he always sat, on the same bench. Only this time people sat beside him, not out of curiosity or obligation, but presence, shared space. A boy from the middle school handed him a card. It said simply, "Thanks for staying." The boy didn't wait for a response. He just smiled and rejoined his friends.